While European nobles in the 14th century were eating with their bare hands in cold, drafty castles, African scholars in Timbuktu were debating astronomy in marble-pillared universities worth more than all of Paris. While London's streets overflowed with human waste, Timbuktu's libraries held 700,000 manuscripts on medicine, mathematics, and law. And while the kings of England and France were borrowing money just to stay in power, one African emperor possessed so much gold that when he traveled to Mecca, he literally crashed the Mediterranean economy for an entire decade. This isn't a myth. This isn't an exaggeration. This is the story of Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire, a civilization so wealthy, so advanced, and so powerful that European cartographers drew its emperor sitting on a throne of solid gold on their maps. But here's what they don't want you to know. The reason this story disappeared from history books wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the truth about Timbuktu's wealth threatened everything the Western world wanted to believe about itself. Our story begins in the heart of West Africa, in a landscape that would shock anyone who thinks of the continent as an endless desert. Picture this, a vast river delta where the Niger River splits into countless tributaries, creating the most fertile land in the Sahel. Here, in what is now Mali, enormous crops of rice and millet grew in abundance. Gold dust glittered in river beds. Salt, worth more than gold in many regions, arrived on camel caravans that stretched for miles across the Sahara. And at the crossroads of these trade routes sat a small trading post that would become the richest city on earth, Timbuktu. But Timbuktu's rise to greatness didn't happen overnight. It emerged from the ashes of an older empire and the vision of one man whose story reads like something out of an epic legend. The year was 1235. The region was controlled by the brutal Sasso kingdom under a tyrant named Sumanguru Kante, who ruled with such cruelty that neighboring kingdoms lived in constant terror. According to the griots, the oral historians who preserve West African history, Sumanguru could only be killed by a weapon made from a white rooster's spur. He wore amulets made from the skin of his enemies. He kept a room filled with the preserved heads of defeated kings. Into this nightmare was born Sundiata Keita, a prince who couldn't walk. The son of a Mandinka king and a hunchbacked woman, Sundiata was crippled from birth. His father's other wives mocked him mercilessly. His own people considered him useless. But his mother, Sagalan, whispered to him every night, "Sundiata, you are the lion, and one day the world will hear you roar." When Sundiata was 7 years old, something changed. In front of the entire court, he grabbed an iron staff, pulled himself upright, and took his first steps. The staff bent under his weight. By the time he was a teenager, he could wrestle grown men to the ground. And when Sumanguru's armies slaughtered Sundiata's family and destroyed his kingdom, the crippled prince became a warrior king. The Battle of Karina in 1235 became the stuff of legend. Sundiata, now leading a coalition of kingdoms, faced Sumanguru's supposedly invincible army. According to the griots, Sundiata had discovered the secret. He fashioned an arrow from a white rooster's spur and shot it into Sumanguru during the battle. Whether this is literally true or metaphorical doesn't matter. What matters is that Sundiata won. He shattered the Sasso kingdom and united the fractured territories into something unprecedented, the Mali Empire. But here's the fascinating part. Sundiata didn't just build an empire through military conquest. He established the Kurokan Fauga, one of the world's oldest constitutions, which guaranteed property rights, outlined rules of warfare, abolished slavery of prisoners of war, and established a federation of kingdoms under central authority. This wasn't a savage dictatorship. This was sophisticated political philosophy being implemented while Europe was still operating under feudal barbarism. And then came the gold. Mali sat on top of approximately half of the world's gold supply during the medieval period. Let that sink in, half. The Bambuk and Bura goldfields produced so much wealth that Mali's emperors could literally afford to give it away. But the real genius wasn't just having gold. It was controlling the trade networks that moved it. Imagine standing at the gates of Timbuktu in 1300. Caravans of 10,000 camels arrived from the north, loaded with slabs of salt mined in the Sahara. Salt, which preserved food and maintained health, was worth its weight in gold in the tropical regions. These same camels would return north loaded with gold, ivory, and enslaved people. To the south, traders brought kola nuts, which contained caffeine and were prized across the Islamic world. To the east came copper, textiles, and knowledge from Cairo and beyond. Timbuktu became the hub where all of this intersected. The city's merchants developed a credit system so sophisticated that a trader could write a note in Timbuktu and have it honored 2,000 miles away in Cairo. They used multiple currencies simultaneously: gold dinars for large transactions, copper for medium exchanges, and cowrie shells for everyday purchases. They had standardized weights and measures. They had commercial courts to settle disputes. They had insurance systems for caravans crossing the dangerous Sahara. While London was still a muddy town of maybe 50,000 people, Timbuktu had grown to a cosmopolitan city of 100,000. Its merchant class lived in multi-story homes made of stone and clay, with interior courtyards and sophisticated architecture adapted perfectly to the desert heat. The city had public baths, mosques with soaring minarets, and markets that sold goods from 3 continents. But what Mansa Musa created wasn't just wealth. It was an intellectual revolution that would make Timbuktu the Oxford of the medieval world. This brings us to 1312 and the moment that would transform everything. When Mansa Musa ascended to the throne, he inherited an empire already wealthy beyond imagination. But he had a vision that went far beyond gold. He wanted to make Mali the intellectual center of the Islamic world. He wanted Timbuktu to shine not just with material wealth but with knowledge. The year was 1324. Mansa Musa announced he would undertake the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim is required to make once in their lifetime. But this wouldn't be an ordinary pilgrimage. This would be a statement of power so audacious, so overwhelming, that the world would never forget the name of Mali. Picture the preparation. 60,000 people assembled for the journey. This wasn't just Mansa Musa and a small retinue of advisors. This was an entire army, hundreds of officials and dignitaries, scholars and holy men, merchants and traders, and 12,000 enslaved people dressed in fine Persian silk. The caravan stretched so far across the desert that the front would reach the next oasis before the rear had left the previous one. But here's where it becomes almost mythical. Mansa Musa brought 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of pure gold. That's 24,000 pounds of gold. Using modern gold prices, that's worth over $1.5 billion, and this was just the gold he brought for spending money on the trip. The caravan moved slowly across the Sahara, a journey of thousands of miles through one of Earth's most hostile environments. When they reached Cairo in July 1324, the Sultan of Egypt, al-Malik al-Nasir, prepared to meet this mysterious African emperor. What happened next would be recorded in shocked detail by Egyptian chroniclers. Mansa Musa refused to prostrate himself before the Sultan. In Islamic protocol, visiting dignitaries were expected to bow before their host as a sign of respect, but Mansa Musa declared that he would only prostrate himself before Allah. The Sultan's court was stunned. Who was this African king who dared to refuse the Sultan of Egypt? The tension in the room was palpable until Mansa Musa offered a compromise. He would bow, but only in prayer toward Mecca, which he did in the Sultan's presence. The Sultan, recognizing both the diplomatic skill and the implicit power statement, accepted this resolution. And then Mansa Musa opened his treasury. Contemporary accounts describe what happened next in almost disbelieving terms. Mansa Musa gave away gold to everyone he encountered. He gave gold to the poor in the streets. He gave gold to scholars and students. He gave lavish gifts to the Sultan and his officials. He purchased goods in the markets, paying with such extravagant amounts of gold that merchants couldn't believe their fortune. He funded the construction and repair of mosques and madrasas. He commissioned scholars to copy texts, but here's the shocking part that most histories gloss over. Mansa Musa gave away so much gold in Cairo that he single-handedly caused economic catastrophe. The sudden massive influx of gold into Cairo's economy caused the value of gold to plummet. Inflation soared by approximately 20%. The value of the Egyptian dinar crashed. The economic disruption rippled across the entire Mediterranean trade network, affecting markets from Alexandria to Constantinople to Venice. Cairo's economy wouldn't fully recover for over a decade. Think about that for a moment. One man's generosity from one city in Africa destabilized the entire Mediterranean economic system. The financial power this represents is almost incomprehensible. It would be as if a single person walked into the global economy today and distributed so much currency that they caused international inflation. Contemporary chronicler Al-Umari wrote, "Gold was at a high price in Egypt until they came in that year. The miskel did not go below 25 dirhams and was generally above, but from that time its value fell and it cheapened in price and has remained cheap till now. The miskel does not exceed 22 dirhams or less. This has been the state of affairs for about 12 years, until this day by reason of the large amount of gold which they brought into Egypt and spent there." Mansa Musa continued to Mecca, where he performed the Hajj rituals and met with scholars from across the Islamic world. He discussed mathematics, astronomy, law, and theology. He commissioned scholars to return with him to Timbuktu. He purchased books, thousands of them, on every subject imaginable. And when he realized he had actually given away too much gold and needed currency for the return journey, he did something that shocked the merchants even more. He took out loans at extremely high interest rates to finance his trip home. Let me explain why this matters. Mansa Musa's willingness to pay exorbitant interest wasn't foolishness. It was a calculated demonstration of power. He was showing that even in debt, he was wealthier than anyone else. He knew that when he returned home, he could easily repay these loans from Mali's gold production. And he did with interest, cementing Mali's reputation as not just wealthy but financially reliable. The journey home took months, but when Mansa Musa finally returned to Timbuktu in 1325, he brought with him something more valuable than all the gold in his treasury. He brought knowledge. He brought scholars, including the architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, whom he commissioned to design the Jingrabur Mosque and the Royal Palace. These structures, built with burnt brick and innovative architectural techniques, still stand today, over 700 years later. But the real transformation happened in education. Mansa Musa invested massive resources into building Timbuktu into a center of learning. The Sankor Mosque became the center of Sankor University, which along with the universities at Jingrabur and Sidi Yahya, created an educational system that rivaled anything in Europe or the Middle East. By the mid-14th century, Sankor University had an enrollment of 25,000 students. Think about that number. Oxford University in the same period had perhaps 1,500 students. The University of Paris had around 4,000. Sankor dwarfed them all. Students came from across Africa and the Islamic world to study in Timbuktu. The curriculum included theology and Islamic law, but also astronomy, mathematics, medicine, chemistry, physics, rhetoric, logic, and history. The city's libraries held over 700,000 manuscripts. That's more books than existed in all of Europe at the time. These weren't just religious texts. They covered every field of human knowledge. Medical textbooks describing surgical procedures, astronomical charts tracking the movements of planets and stars, mathematical treatises on algebra and geometry, legal commentaries on complex questions of governance and justice, literary works of poetry and philosophy, historical chronicles of empires and kingdoms. The manuscripts were valuable beyond measure, and wealthy families in Timbuktu competed to build the most impressive personal libraries. The Ahmed Baba Institute in modern Timbuktu has preserved thousands of these manuscripts, and scholars continue to study them, constantly discovering new insights into medieval African intellectual achievement. What happened in Timbuktu under Mansa Musa and his successors was the flourishing of what historians now call the Timbuktu Renaissance. While Europe was emerging from the Dark Ages, Timbuktu was already operating at a level of intellectual sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance itself. But Mansa Musa's fame came with a problem that no one had ever faced before. By revealing Mali's wealth to the world, he had painted a target on his empire's back. Mansa Musa died in 1337, having ruled for 25 years, and transformed Mali from a wealthy kingdom into a legend. His son Mansa Magan ruled briefly before dying, and the throne passed through several hands. The empire Mansa Musa built continued to thrive for decades, but the very things that made it magnificent were already sowing the seeds of its vulnerability. Here's what audiences don't understand. Empires built on trade are inherently fragile. They depend on stable roots, peaceful relations with neighbors, and the continued flow of goods. Mali controlled the gold, but it didn't control the entire trade network, and when that network began to shift, everything started to unravel. The year was 1375. European cartographers created the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval world. On this map in the middle of West Africa, they drew Mansa Musa sitting on a throne, holding a gold nugget with the caption, "This Negro lord is called Musa Mali, Lord of the Guinea." So abundant is the gold found in his country that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land. The map was beautiful. It was also a death sentence, because now everyone knew exactly where the gold was coming from. And in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the balance of power in the Mediterranean and Atlantic world was shifting rapidly. The Portuguese were developing new ship technologies that would allow them to sail down the African coast. The Ottoman Empire was expanding, controlling more and more of the eastern trade routes, and European kingdoms, recovering from the Black Death and building centralized monarchies, were hungry for the wealth they had heard about in Africa. But the real crisis was internal. After Mansa Musa's death, the Mali Empire faced the same challenge that destroys most empires: succession disputes and provincial rebellions. The Mossi kingdoms to the south began raiding Mali's southern territories. The Tuareg Berbers in the north, who had been kept in check by Mali's military power, began to reassert control over the Saharan trade routes. And within Mali itself, provincial governors started acting like independent rulers, keeping tax revenues for themselves instead of sending them to the capital. By 1400, Mali still controlled Timbuktu, but its grip was weakening. The flow of gold continued, but the centralized authority that Sundiata had established and Mansa Musa had perfected was fragmenting. The empire was beginning to fracture into competing regions, each controlled by local elites who recognized the emperor's authority in name only. And then came the Songhai. The Songhai people had been part of the Mali Empire, controlling the eastern regions along the Niger River. But they chafed under Mali's rule. They remembered their own empire that had existed before Mali conquered them, and they saw opportunity in Mali's weakness. In 1464, a Songhai ruler named Sunni Ali Bur launched a military campaign that would shatter what remained of Mali's power. Sunni Ali was a military genius and a religious pragmatist. He blended Islam with traditional African religions, which made him controversial among Muslim scholars but popular with many common people. He built a professional army and a navy of war canoes that controlled the Niger River. And in 1468, he did what would have been unthinkable a century earlier. He conquered Timbuktu. The conquest was brutal. Sunni Ali's forces killed many of Timbuktu's scholars, viewing them as representatives of the old Mali elite. Libraries were looted. Manuscripts were destroyed or scattered. The intellectual community that Mansa Musa had built was torn apart. Many scholars fled to other cities, taking their precious books with them. Some manuscripts were hidden in desert caves or buried in family compounds, where they would remain for centuries. But here's the part that makes this story even more tragic. While the Songhai were conquering Timbuktu from the east, Portuguese ships were arriving on the West African coast. In 1434, Portuguese explorers had rounded Cape Bojador. By 1471, they had reached the Gold Coast of modern-day Ghana. They built fortresses like Elmina Castle and began trading directly with coastal kingdoms, bypassing the Saharan trade routes entirely. This was catastrophic for Timbuktu. The city's wealth had always depended on being the indispensable middleman in the trans-Saharan trade. But now, European ships could sail directly to the source of gold, ivory, and enslaved people. They could trade European goods like textiles, guns, and alcohol directly with coastal African kingdoms. The centuries-old trade routes that had made Timbuktu rich were becoming obsolete. The Songhai Empire, under Sunni Ali and later under Askia Mohammed, tried to maintain Timbuktu's importance. They rebuilt the universities and invited scholars to return. Under Askia Mohammed, who ruled from 1493 to 1528, Timbuktu experienced a final golden age. The libraries were restored. The mosques were renovated. Scholars once again debated in the courtyards of Sankor. But it was a sunset bloom, beautiful but brief, because by this point, the world was changing in ways that would doom not just Timbuktu, but the entire system of African empires that had flourished during the medieval period. The Portuguese discovery of sea routes to India meant that even the spice trade, which had partially moved through North Africa, was now bypassing the continent entirely. The Atlantic slave trade, which would eventually dwarf all previous forms of slavery, was beginning to reorganize African societies around the capture and sale of human beings to European traders. And in 1591, everything came crashing down. When the Moroccan army crossed the Sahara and arrived at the gates of Timbuktu, nobody could have predicted that this would be the end of West African imperial power for centuries. The Moroccans were armed with arquebuses, early firearms that made terrifying noise and could punch through traditional armor. The Songhai army, despite vastly outnumbering the Moroccan force, broke and ran when they heard the gunfire. It was one of history's first demonstrations of how superior military technology could overcome numerical advantage. The Moroccans sacked Timbuktu. They arrested scholars and sent them in chains to Marrakesh. They looted the libraries, though they couldn't take everything, and much was hidden by families who understood what was being lost. They imposed harsh taxes and brutal rule. The intellectual life of the city died. The remaining scholars fled or fell silent. The manuscripts that had survived previous wars and conquests were scattered, buried, or destroyed. Over the following decades, Timbuktu descended from a center of learning and wealth into a provincial town on the edge of nowhere. The population declined. The trade routes shifted further as European coastal trade dominated. The great houses of merchants and scholars fell into disrepair. Sand from the encroaching Sahara began to bury the streets. Here's the shocking truth that most histories don't tell you. This wasn't just military conquest or economic competition. This was systematic erasure of African achievement from the historical record. As European powers colonized Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries, they needed to justify their actions with a narrative of African backwardness and savagery. The existence of sophisticated African empires, cities richer than European capitals, and intellectual traditions that rivaled anything in Europe contradicted this narrative completely. So they erased it. They didn't talk about Mansa Musa in their history books. They ignored or downplayed the universities of Timbuktu. They characterized African societies as primitive and without history. They claimed that any sophisticated structures or traditions must have been imported from Arabs or Europeans. They systematically constructed a false history that positioned Africa as a continent of barbarism rescued by European civilization. This wasn't accidental. It was calculated. Because if Europeans acknowledged that Africans had built empires as sophisticated as Mali, that African cities had been centers of learning, while European cities were plague-ridden, that African economic systems had been more advanced than European ones, then the entire moral justification for colonialism collapsed. For over 400 years, Timbuktu was essentially erased from Western consciousness. If it was mentioned at all, it was as a metaphor for a remote, unreachable place, the ends of the earth. From here to Timbuktu became an expression meaning impossibly far away. The reality of what Timbuktu had been, what Mali had been, was deliberately forgotten. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that serious efforts began to recover this history. UNESCO designated Timbuktu a World Heritage Site. Scholars began the painstaking work of cataloging and preserving the surviving manuscripts. Historians started to piece together the true story of Mali and Timbuktu from Arabic sources, oral traditions, and archaeological evidence. And slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge from centuries of suppression. Today, as we recover these manuscripts and reconstruct this history, we're not just learning about the past. We're confronting uncomfortable questions about how history is written, who gets to write it, and what stories are deliberately excluded. Every manuscript that emerges from a family library in Timbuktu, every archaeological discovery that reveals the sophistication of medieval African societies, is a challenge to the racist narratives that justified centuries of colonialism and still shape perceptions today. Mansa Musa's legacy endures in every manuscript saved from the sands of Timbuktu, in every scholar working to recover this history, in every student who learns that African empires weren't primitive, but were among the most sophisticated civilizations of their time. His pilgrimage to Mecca, which crashed an economy with generosity, stands as a testament to wealth and power that European kingdoms could only dream of possessing. But perhaps most importantly, Mansa Musa reminds us that greatness can emerge anywhere, that intellectual and economic achievement aren't the property of any single culture or race, and that even the most magnificent achievements can be lost if we don't work to preserve them. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, hidden in desert caves and family libraries, survived centuries of neglect and destruction. They survived because families understood their value and protected them at great risk. They survived because the truth, no matter how long it's suppressed, has a way of resurfacing. The story of Timbuktu forces us to confront what we've been taught and what we've believed about history, progress, and civilization itself. It demands that we ask, what other truths have been buried? What other achievements have been erased? And what will we do to make sure this erasure never happens again? If this story opened your eyes to how history has been manipulated to serve power rather than truth, hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories that challenge everything you thought you knew. Let me know in the comments what other deliberately erased civilizations you think deserve to have their stories told, because the truth is always more incredible than fiction. You just have to know where to look for it. And you have to be willing to question everything you've been taught about who built civilization and where greatness comes from. Mansa Musa and the scholars of Timbuktu are waiting to have their full story told. Don't let it be buried again.